A lonely girl appeared every night at the gas station. When the millionaire decided to speak with her, he discovered a secret that brought tears to his eyes. The headlights of a car flickered across the dark, empty lot of the gas station. Alyssa, her small frame hunched over, watched the vehicles come and go, her eyes cautious but curious. She stuck close to the red vending machine, feeling the cold metal press against her back. The glow from the overhead lights cast long shadows across her worn-out yellow dress. She had been here for days, and each night felt colder, each one stretching longer. Her stomach ached with hunger, but Alyssa had grown used to the emptiness. It was late, and there was no one around except for the gas station employee, who shot her the occasional glance. Never friendly. She slid down to sit on the curb, her legs stretched out in front of her, resting her hands on the pavement. Her eyes flickered across the lot, locking briefly with those of a tired driver who walked out of his car and into the convenience store. She held her breath, hoping he wouldn't ask any questions. He didn't. No one ever really did. At night, Alyssa would curl up on the concrete bench next to the building. It wasn't much, but it was what she had. The wind bit at her skin, and she shivered, pulling her knees to her chest for warmth. Her thoughts wandered, and suddenly, her father's face flashed across her mind. She hadn't seen him in days. She didn't want to think about him, didn't want to think about the last words she said to him. Her chest tightened, and she pushed the thought away, focusing instead on counting the cars that drove past the station. There was a noise behind her, the gas station door slamming shut. Alyssa turned her head, just in time to see the employee walking towards her, his expression hard and annoyed. She stood up quickly, trying to make herself look smaller. He waved his hands, gesturing for her to move along. "Hey, kid, you can't stay here," he barked, his voice echoing slightly in the quiet night. Alyssa dropped her gaze, nodding silently. She took a step back, moving closer to the side of the building. The man sighed, shaking his head before turning back, mumbling something Alyssa couldn't hear. She felt her face flush, the sting of embarrassment settling in her chest. She wrapped her arms around herself, her fingers brushing against the frayed edges of her sleeves. For a moment she looked down the road, wondering if she should just keep walking. But where would she go? The thought of going home terrified her. Her father's voice, loud and desperate, echoed in her ears from that night. The night they argued, the night she ran. Alyssa closed her eyes and took a shaky breath, the lump in her throat growing bigger. Suddenly there was a flicker of headlights from a car pulling into the station. Alyssa glanced up, wiping her eyes quickly with the back of her hand. It was a sleek black car, much nicer than anything else that had driven by tonight. The car parked near the convenience store, and a man stepped out. He was well dressed, wearing a suit and tie, his hair neatly combed back. He looked out of place here, too clean, too polished. The man walked towards the vending machine, and as he approached, Alyssa pressed herself against the wall, trying not to be noticed. He stopped for a moment, his eyes catching hers, and there was a brief pause. Alyssa looked away quickly, her heart pounding. She wasn't sure why, but there was something different about this man. He wasn't like the others who came to fill up their cars and leave without a second glance. He moved closer to the machine, but his gaze returned to Alyssa, his brow furrowed slightly. After a moment, he bent down, pulling something out of his pocket, a small packaged sandwich. He held it out towards her, his voice gentle. "Hey, you look like you could use this." Alyssa stared at the sandwich, her eyes wide, and then looked up at the man. She didn't say anything, her body tense. The man waited, holding it out patiently, his expression softening. "It's okay. It's for you. You don't have to say anything," he added. Hesitantly, Alyssa reached out, her fingers brushing against the plastic before she took it from him. She held it close to her chest, her eyes fixed on the ground. The man nodded, a small smile touching his lips. "What's your name?" he asked, his voice calm. Alyssa looked up at him, unsure if she should answer. She swallowed hard, her voice barely a whisper. "Alyssa." He nodded again. "Nice to meet you, Alyssa. I'm David." Alyssa didn't respond, her gaze shifting back to the ground. David seemed to sense her hesitation, and he didn't push. Instead, he took a step back, his hands slipping into his pockets. "You know, it's pretty cold out here. You sure you're okay?" he asked. Alyssa hugged the sandwich tighter, nodding slightly. She didn't trust him. She didn't trust anyone, especially not strangers. David watched her for a moment, then sighed. "Well, if you need anything, I'll be here for a bit," he said, pointing towards his car. Alyssa nodded again, but she stayed where she was, her eyes following him as he walked back to his car. He sat inside, leaving the door open, and glanced back at her from time to time. Alyssa unwrapped the sandwich slowly, her stomach growling as the smell hit her nose. She took a small bite, chewing carefully, her eyes never leaving the man by the car. She didn't know why he was being nice to her. People didn't just do that, not for no reason. But she was too hungry to question it much right now. She ate quietly, her body still tense, ready to run if she had to. David didn't move from his spot, and Alyssa found herself glancing at him occasionally, wondering what his story was. Why was he here, in the middle of the night at this gas station? David's phone rang and he answered, his voice muffled by the sound of cars passing by. Alyssa couldn't make out his words, but he didn't seem bothered. He looked back towards her, giving her a small nod, as if reassuring her that he was still there. Alyssa finished the sandwich, folding the wrapper and tucking it into her pocket. The warmth from the food helped, but it didn't ease the chill that settled deep inside her. She leaned back against the vending machine, her eyes closing for a moment. The thought of home came back again. Her dad, the fight, the look in his eyes when she shouted at him. The pain in her chest grew, and she tried to push it away. David stepped out of his car again, walking slowly towards her, careful not to startle her. He stopped a few feet away, his eyes gentle. "Do you need a ride somewhere?" he asked. Alyssa shook her head quickly, her body tensing. She didn't want to go anywhere with him. She didn't know him. David nodded, not pressing further. "Okay, but I'll be here if you change your mind," he said. Alyssa watched as he returned to his car, leaving her alone again. She didn't know what to think of him. Part of her wanted to trust him, to believe that someone actually cared. But the other part of her, the part that had been hurt too many times, told her to keep her distance, to stay alone. She took a deep breath, her eyes fixed on the ground, the sound of cars filling the empty space around her. The night grew colder, and Alyssa wrapped her arms around herself again. She looked over at David's car, seeing him still there, his gaze occasionally drifting towards her. She didn't know why he was still waiting. Maybe he was just like everyone else, curious, but not willing to really help. She leaned her head back against the vending machine, her eyes closing. For now, she would stay here. It was the only place she knew, the only place that felt familiar, even if it was cold, even if it hurt. It was better than facing what was waiting for her at home. The cold breeze swept through the empty lot, causing Alyssa to shiver as she hugged her arms around herself. She watched David sit in his car, door still open, occasionally glancing her way. Part of her wanted to walk away, disappear into the night, but her body was exhausted, and her mind was too tired to decide. David got out of his car again. This time he was holding a bag from the convenience store. He walked slowly towards her, his expression open and cautious. Alyssa watched, eyes narrowed as he approached. He stopped a few feet away, kneeling down so he was closer to her level. "Hey," he said softly, holding out the bag. "I grabbed a couple of things from the store, some snacks in case you want them." Alyssa eyed the bag, her eyes shifting to his face, and then back to the bag. She didn't move, her back pressed against the cold vending machine. David waited patiently, his hand not moving. "It's okay, Alyssa," he said. "You don't have to take it. I just thought you might be hungry." Alyssa hesitated for a moment longer, then slowly reached out, her fingers brushing against the plastic handle of the bag. She pulled it towards her, still watching David. He gave her a small smile. "Good. I'm glad you took it. There's some water in there too," he said, standing back up. Alyssa looked inside the bag, seeing a small bottle of water, a pack of crackers, and some fruit snacks. She swallowed hard, her throat tight as she tried to make sense of what was happening. Why was he being nice? No one had been nice to her in a long time, not since her mom. Alyssa shook her head, forcing the thought away. David took a step back, giving her space. He leaned against the wall of the convenience store, crossing his arms, his eyes on the dark road ahead. "Do you have somewhere to go?" he asked, his voice gentle. Alyssa shook her head, not looking up from the bag. "No family? No friends?" he continued. She stayed silent, her hands fiddling with the edge of the bag. The questions made her stomach twist, and she clenched her jaw, willing herself not to cry. David seemed to sense her discomfort, and he took a deep breath, changing his approach. "I used to be like that too, you know, alone, not really knowing where to go," he said, his eyes still on the road. Alyssa glanced at him, her curiosity piqued. David smiled slightly, his gaze turning to meet hers. "Yeah," he nodded. "I didn't have much when I was your age. I didn't know who to trust or where I belonged. It took me a long time to figure it out." Alyssa stared at him for a moment, her brow furrowed. She wanted to ask what had happened, why he was alone, but the words got stuck in her throat. Instead, she just looked back down at the snacks, her fingers brushing against the crinkling wrapper. David shifted his weight, looking down at her, his expression softening. "I know you don't know me, Alyssa, and I know you probably don't trust me, but I want to help if you'll let me." Alyssa didn't say anything. Her chest felt tight, her heart pounding. She wanted to trust him, but she didn't know if she could. Trusting people always seemed to lead to hurt. David seemed to understand her hesitation. He nodded, not pushing her for more. "It's okay. You don't have to decide anything right now. I just want you to know that I'm here, if you need anything." Alyssa looked at him, her eyes searching his face. There was something about him that seemed genuine, something that made her want to believe him. She took a deep breath, her voice barely a whisper. "Why are you doing this?" she asked. David's eyes met hers, and he gave her a sad smile. "Because I see someone who needs help, and I know what it feels like to need help and not have anyone there." Alyssa's chest tightened, and she looked away, blinking back tears. She didn't want to cry in front of him. She didn't want to seem weak. David stayed quiet, giving her space. He didn't push her, didn't ask more questions. He just stood there, watching over her like some kind of silent guardian. After a moment, Alyssa spoke, her voice shaky. I don't have anywhere to go." David nodded, his eyes softening. "Okay, we'll figure it out. You don't have to be alone tonight." Alyssa looked at him, her eyes wide, fear flickering across her face. I can't go home," she whispered. David frowned, his brow furrowing. "Why not? Is it not safe?" Alyssa shook her head, her throat tightening. "No, it's not that. I can't face my dad. Not after—" Her voice trailed off and she bit her lip, her eyes filling with tears. David took a step closer, his voice gentle. "Hey, it's okay. You don't have to tell me if you don't want to." Alyssa swallowed hard, her hands trembling as she wiped her eyes. I don't think he wants me there." David's expression softened even more, and he knelt down in front of her, his eyes level with hers. "Alyssa, I don't know your dad, but I'm pretty sure he's worried sick about you right now." Alyssa shook her head, her tears spilling over. "No, we had a fight. He blames me for my mom." David's eyes widened slightly and he stayed quiet for a moment, letting her words sink in. He could see the pain etched on her face, the weight of guilt she was carrying. He took a deep breath, his voice calm. "I'm sure that's not true. I think maybe he's just hurting, like you are." Alyssa looked away, her shoulders shaking. She wanted to believe him, but the memory of her father's angry face was too fresh, too real. She hugged herself tighter, her body trembling. David sighed, standing up again. He didn't want to push her too much, too fast. "Look, Alyssa, I know this is hard, but maybe I can help you talk to him. Maybe we can figure this out together." Alyssa looked up at him, her eyes filled with doubt and fear. She opened her mouth to speak, but before she could say anything, the gas station door opened and the employee walked out again, his face set in a frown. "Hey, what's going on here?" he demanded, his eyes darting between Alyssa and David. David turned, his expression calm but firm. "It's okay. We're just talking." The employee scowled, crossing his arms. "Talking, huh? I don't want any trouble here. If you're not buying anything, you both need to leave." Alyssa's heart pounded, panic rising in her chest. She took a step back, her eyes wide as she looked at David. She didn't want to be taken away, didn't want to be separated from her dad forever, no matter how scared she was to face him. David held up his hands, trying to calm the employee. "Look, we're not causing any trouble. I'm just trying to help her." The employee shook his head, his face hard. "I don't care. You need to go, now." Alyssa felt her chest tighten, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. She looked at David, her eyes pleading. David turned back to her, his face softening. "It's okay, Alyssa. We're going to figure this out, I promise," he said, his voice steady. Alyssa nodded, her body trembling. David put a hand on her shoulder, guiding her towards his car. She followed, her eyes darting nervously towards the employee, who was still watching them, his face set in a scowl. David opened the passenger door, helping Alyssa inside. He closed the door gently, then walked around to the driver's side, getting in. He started the car, glancing over at Alyssa. "Don't worry, okay? We're going to figure this out," he said again, his voice calm and reassuring. Alyssa nodded, her eyes wide, her heart pounding. She didn't know what was going to happen next, but for the first time in a long time, she felt like maybe, just maybe, she wasn't completely alone. David drove down the empty road, his hands steady on the wheel. The gas station lights faded behind them, leaving just the dark, almost endless highway ahead. Alyssa sat silently beside him, her eyes flicking nervously towards the rearview mirror, as if afraid someone might be following them. The hum of the car filled the quiet space, and Alyssa pulled her knees up to her chest, resting her chin on top of them. "Do you have anywhere you want me to take you?" David asked, his voice gentle, not wanting to startle her. Alyssa shook her head without saying anything. Her gaze remained fixed on the road ahead, her body tense. She didn't know where she wanted to go. She didn't know if she even wanted to go anywhere at all. She just knew she couldn't go back to that gas station. She couldn't handle the angry employee or the cold nights alone any longer. David glanced at her, concern etched across his face. He didn't want to push her, but he needed to know what he could do to help. "How about I take you somewhere warm, at least for tonight? Maybe we can find a safe place for you to rest, and then we can figure out what to do next." Alyssa turned her head slightly, her eyes meeting his for a brief second before she looked away again. "I don't want to go to any shelters," she muttered. "They'll call the cops and then my dad will find me." David nodded, understanding the fear in her voice. He had heard stories like this before, kids running away because they were scared, alone with nowhere to turn. He didn't want to betray her trust by taking her somewhere she didn't want to be. "Okay, no shelters," he said. He thought for a moment, then continued. "How about my place, just for tonight? I've got a spare room and it's warm. I promise I won't do anything you don't want. You can leave any time." Alyssa hesitated, her brow furrowed. She didn't know him. Not really. But he had given her food and he had stayed, even when he didn't have to. He seemed different from the others, genuinely concerned. She chewed her lip, uncertainty twisting in her gut. "Why are you helping me?" she finally asked, her voice quiet. David kept his eyes on the road, the lights from the dashboard casting shadows on his face. "Because I see a lot of myself in you, Alyssa, and I didn't have anyone to help me when I needed it most. I don't want you to feel like you have to do this alone." Alyssa didn't know what to say to that. She let her eyes drift out the window, watching the dark silhouettes of trees pass by. She wanted to trust him, but trust was hard. Trusting people got you hurt, got you abandoned. After a few minutes of silence, she spoke again, her voice almost lost in the hum of the engine. "I'm scared." David's gaze softened and he nodded. "I know, and that's okay. It's okay to be scared." Alyssa swallowed, her throat tight. She turned back towards him, her voice trembling. What if my dad doesn't want me back?" David took a deep breath, glancing at her before returning his eyes to the road. "I think he does, Alyssa. I really think he does. Sometimes people they don't know how to show it, especially when they're hurting too." Alyssa blinked rapidly, fighting back tears. She didn't want to cry in front of him. She was tired of crying, tired of feeling like this. "I said awful things to him," she whispered. "I said he should have saved my mom. And he couldn't. He couldn't save her." David's heart ached hearing her words, the pain raw in her voice. He stayed silent for a moment, letting her words hang in the air. He could hear the weight of guilt she was carrying, the anger and sadness she was struggling to hold in. "Sometimes we say things we don't mean," David said softly, "especially when we're hurting. I think your dad understands that. I think he's probably said some things he regrets too." Alyssa shook her head, tears spilling down her cheeks. "He looked so angry, like he hated me." David's expression softened, and he pulled the car to the side of the road, putting it in park. He turned to face Alyssa, his eyes gentle. "Look, I know I can't make any promises about how he feels, but I do know that he's been looking for you. He wants you back, and I can help you if you want me to." Alyssa wiped her face with her sleeve, sniffling. Her voice was shaky. What if it's worse when I go back? What if he blames me forever?" David reached over, his hand resting gently on her shoulder. "If it's worse, we'll deal with it together. You don't have to go through that alone. You have me now, okay?" Alyssa looked at him, her eyes filled with fear and uncertainty, but also with a glimmer of hope. She nodded slowly, her body relaxing slightly. Maybe, just maybe, she didn't have to do this alone anymore. David started the car again, merging back onto the road. The silence between them was different now, not as heavy, not as filled with fear. Alyssa watched the road ahead, her fingers fiddling with the strap of her backpack. After a while, David spoke, his voice breaking the silence. "You know, if you decide to talk to your dad, I'll be there, I'll stay with you. You don't have to face him by yourself." Alyssa looked at him, her eyes wide. "You'd do that?" David smiled slightly. "Yeah, I'd do that." Alyssa didn't say anything, but she nodded, her eyes drifting back to the window. The fear was still there, but now it was mixed with something else, something that felt almost like hope. She wasn't sure what was going to happen, but for the first time in a long time, she felt like maybe, just maybe, there was a chance things could get better. Suddenly there were flashing lights behind them, red and blue, lighting up the dark road. Alyssa's heart jumped into her throat, panic flooding her body. "David," she whispered, her voice trembling. "The police." David looked in the rearview mirror, his expression tensing. He pulled the car over to the side of the road again, his heart pounding. He glanced at Alyssa, seeing the fear in her eyes. "Hey, it's okay," he said, trying to sound calm. "It's going to be okay. I'll handle this." Alyssa nodded, her hands trembling as she gripped the edge of her seat. She watched as a police officer approached the car, his flashlight shining through the window. David rolled down the window, giving the officer a polite smile. "Evening, officer," David said. The officer nodded, his flashlight moving to Alyssa, who shrank back slightly. "Good evening. We got a call about a young girl matching her description. Everything okay here?" David nodded, his expression calm. "Yes, officer. Everything is fine. She's with me and I'm just trying to help her get back home." The officer looked at Alyssa, his expression softening. "Miss, is that true? Are you okay?" Alyssa swallowed hard, her throat dry. She nodded slowly, her voice barely a whisper. "Yeah, I'm okay." The officer studied her for a moment, then looked back at David. "All right, just making sure. You folks take care now and stay safe." David nodded, giving the officer a grateful smile. "Thank you, officer, we will." The officer tipped his hat and walked back to his car. Alyssa let out a shaky breath, her body relaxing slightly as the flashing lights disappeared down the road. David glanced at her, his eyes filled with concern. "You okay?" he asked. Alyssa nodded, her voice trembling. "Yeah. I don't want to be taken away. I want to see my dad." David smiled gently. "Then that's what we'll do. We're going to get you back to him. Together." Alyssa looked at him, her eyes wet with tears, and she nodded. For the first time, she felt like maybe there was a way forward. Maybe with David's help, she could face whatever was waiting for her at home. The road stretched on, the night wrapping around them like a dark blanket. The flashing lights of the police car were now far behind, but the tension in the air still lingered. Alyssa took a deep breath, her body leaning back against the seat, trying to calm her racing heart. David kept glancing at her, concern still etched on his face. They were approaching the outskirts of the city now, where the lights were fewer and the houses more spaced out. David slowed the car and spoke softly, trying not to startle her. "I was thinking we could stop somewhere for the night," he said, his eyes briefly meeting hers before looking back at the road. "Just to get some rest, and we can figure things out in the morning. Does that sound okay to you?" Alyssa was silent for a moment, her gaze fixed on the window. She wasn't sure. She wasn't used to people asking for her opinion, and she wasn't used to making decisions like this. Slowly, she nodded, her eyes flicking back towards David. "Okay," she whispered. David gave her a small, reassuring smile. "Good. There's a motel not too far from here. We can stay there, and I promise I'll get you your own room so you feel safe. I want you to be comfortable." Alyssa nodded again, her eyes still on her hands. She could feel her heart pounding, the fear of the unknown clawing at her chest. But there was also a strange sense of relief. She wasn't alone, and that made all the difference. She turned slightly, watching the road as they pulled into the parking lot of a small, worn-down motel. David parked the car and turned to her. "You wait here, okay? I'll go get us checked in." Alyssa nodded, her body curling up tighter in the seat. David gave her another reassuring look before stepping out of the car and heading towards the office. Alyssa watched him, her eyes scanning the area. The motel looked old and a bit run down, but there were warm lights in the windows, and she could see a few people walking around. It was better than the gas station, At least it was somewhere inside. David returned a few minutes later, holding 2 room keys. He opened her door, offering her a hand. "Come on, Alyssa. Let's get you settled." Alyssa took his hand, her small fingers wrapping around his, and climbed out of the car. She followed him as he led her to one of the rooms. David unlocked the door, pushing it open, and Alyssa peeked inside. The room was small, with just a bed and a bathroom, but it was warm. She stepped in, glancing around. David handed her the key, his eyes gentle. "This is your room. I'm right next door if you need anything at all. You just knock, okay?" Alyssa nodded, clutching the key tightly. She didn't know what to say, her throat tight with emotion. She wasn't used to kindness like this. David gave her a small smile, stepping back towards the door. "Get some rest. I'll be right here if you need me," he said. Alyssa looked at him, her eyes wide. "David?" she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. David paused, turning back to her. "Yeah?" "Thank you," she whispered, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. David's smile widened, and he nodded. "You're welcome, Alyssa. I'm just glad I can help." He stepped out, closing the door gently behind him. Alyssa stood there for a moment, staring at the door, her heart heavy. She turned and walked over to the bed, sitting down. The mattress creaked under her weight, and she let out a shaky breath. She was safe, at least for now. She looked down at her hands, her fingers fidgeting with the frayed edge of her sleeve. For the first time in days, she felt like maybe she could sleep. She lay down, curling up on the bed, her eyes drifting shut. The darkness seemed less frightening now, with David just a room away. The next morning, sunlight peeked through the curtains, filling the small room with a soft golden glow. Alyssa blinked awake, her eyes adjusting to the light. For a moment, she forgot where she was, panic setting in. But then she remembered. David, the motel, the promise of safety. She sat up slowly, rubbing her eyes. There was a knock at the door, and her heart jumped in her chest. She stood up, moving towards the door and opening it a crack. David stood there, holding 2 paper cups of steaming coffee, a gentle smile on his face. "Morning, Alyssa. I brought you something warm to drink," he said, holding out one of the cups. Alyssa opened the door wider, taking the cup with both hands. "Thank you," she murmured, the warmth of the cup seeping into her fingers. David nodded, stepping back slightly. "How'd you sleep?" Alyssa shrugged, looking down at the coffee. "Okay, I guess," she said quietly. David smiled. "That's good. I was thinking we could grab something to eat, and then, if you want, we can talk about what to do next." Alyssa took a sip of the coffee, her eyes flicking up to meet his. She hesitated, then nodded. "Okay." David's smile grew, and he gestured towards the parking lot. "There's a diner just down the street. They've got pancakes. How does that sound?" Alyssa hesitated for a moment, then gave him a small smile. "I like pancakes." David laughed softly. "Good. Let's go." The diner was small and cozy, the smell of bacon and fresh coffee filling the air. David and Alyssa sat at a booth near the window, the sun streaming in, warming their faces. David watched as Alyssa scanned the menu, her eyes wide as she took in all the choices. "You can get whatever you want," David said, his voice gentle. Alyssa glanced up at him, her eyes uncertain. "Are you sure?" David nodded. "Absolutely." She nodded slowly, her eyes returning to the menu. When the waitress came over, Alyssa ordered a stack of pancakes, her voice barely above a whisper. David ordered a coffee and an omelet, giving the waitress a polite smile as she walked away. After a moment of silence, David cleared his throat. "Alyssa, I've been thinking, if you want, we could go see your dad today. I know it's scary, but I really think it might help." Alyssa's face tensed, her eyes dropping to the table. She didn't say anything, her fingers tracing the edge of her napkin. David watched her, his heart aching for the girl in front of him. He could see the fear, the hesitation, the weight of everything she'd been through. "You don't have to decide right now," David said softly. "I just want you to know that I'm here for you, no matter what you choose." Alyssa took a deep breath, her eyes still on the table. She nodded, her voice shaky. I want to see him, but I don't know if I can." David reached across the table, his hand resting gently on hers. "You can, and I'll be right there with you." Alyssa looked up, her eyes filled with tears. What if he doesn't want me back?" David shook his head, his voice firm. "He does, Alyssa. I know he does. He's been looking for you. He wants you back." Alyssa swallowed hard, her tears spilling over. "I'm scared." David squeezed her hand gently. "I know, and that's okay. But you're not alone. You've got me." Alyssa looked at him, her heart pounding. For the first time, she let herself believe him. Maybe, just maybe, there was a chance that things could get better. She nodded slowly, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. "Okay," she whispered. "I'll try." David smiled, his eyes soft. "That's all I ask. One step at a time, okay?" Alyssa nodded, her heart still heavy but somehow a little lighter. She didn't know what would happen when she saw her dad, but she knew she wasn't alone. And that made all the difference. The waitress returned, setting a plate of pancakes in front of Alyssa, who looked up, her eyes widening at the sight. David chuckled softly, watching as she picked up the syrup bottle, her lips curving into a small smile. It was a small moment, but it felt like a step in the right direction, a step towards something better. David took a sip of his coffee, his eyes watching Alyssa as she took her first bite of pancakes. For now, they were here, and they were safe. And that was enough. The warm comfort of the diner began to fade as David and Alyssa walked back towards the car. The sun was now higher in the sky, and the day had a crispness to it that made everything seem sharper. Alyssa clutched her jacket, her fingers fidgeting at the seams. The pancakes had helped ease her hunger, but her stomach still felt tight with nerves at the thought of what they were about to do. David opened the passenger door for Alyssa, giving her a reassuring smile. "Ready?" Alyssa hesitated before nodding slightly, her eyes a mix of fear and determination. She climbed into the seat, settling in as David closed the door behind her. He walked around to the driver's side, got in, and started the car. The rumble of the engine filled the silence between them, and Alyssa's heart pounded harder with each passing second. David pulled out of the diner parking lot, heading towards the address he had managed to find, Alyssa's home. He glanced over at her, seeing her stare at her hands, her expression tense. "Remember, you don't have to do anything you're not ready for," David said gently. "I'm just here to help. Whatever you want to do, we do it your way." Alyssa nodded, her fingers trembling slightly as she pressed them together. "Okay," she whispered, her voice barely audible. They drove for a few minutes, the silence between them heavy with unspoken fears. David could feel Alyssa's anxiety radiating off her, and he wished he could do more to comfort her. He turned the radio on softly, hoping the music might help ease some of the tension. A gentle tune played, filling the car with a bit of warmth. Alyssa closed her eyes, taking a deep breath. As they got closer to Alyssa's neighborhood, David slowed the car, his gaze flicking to her every few moments. "We're almost there. Are you doing okay?" Alyssa opened her eyes, her heart pounding in her chest. The familiarity of the streets brought back memories, some good, some painful. She looked out the window, her eyes scanning the houses. They passed the corner store she used to walk to with her mom, and a pang of sadness hit her chest. She swallowed hard, nodding at David's question even though she wasn't entirely sure if she was okay. David pulled onto her street, driving slowly until he reached her house. It looked quiet, almost exactly as she remembered it. The curtains were drawn, and the front yard looked a little more unkempt than before. David parked a few houses down, cutting the engine and turning towards Alyssa. "We're here," he said softly. "Do you want me to come with you?" Alyssa's heart felt like it was in her throat. She stared at the house, her eyes catching sight of the front door. She could almost imagine her dad standing there, his face filled with a mix of anger and pain. Her breathing grew shallow, and she turned to David, her eyes wide with panic. "Please come with me," she said, her voice trembling. David nodded immediately. "Of course, I'm not going anywhere." He got out of the car, coming around to her side and opening the door. Alyssa stepped out, her legs feeling shaky beneath her. She walked beside David, her hands wrapped tightly around the straps of her backpack as they approached the house. Each step felt heavy, the weight of everything pressing down on her. David reached the front steps, pausing to look at Alyssa. "Do you want to knock, or should I?" Alyssa hesitated, then nodded towards him. "You do it." David nodded, raising his hand and knocking firmly on the door. The sound echoed through the stillness of the morning. They waited, Alyssa's heart pounding so hard she thought it might burst out of her chest. She clenched her jaw, trying to stay calm, trying to keep the fear from swallowing her whole. There was the sound of footsteps, and then the door opened. Alyssa's father stood there, his face gaunt, his eyes bloodshot from sleepless nights. He looked at David first, confusion crossing his features, and then his gaze shifted to Alyssa. "Alyssa," he breathed, his voice cracking. Alyssa froze, her eyes wide as she looked at him. He seemed different, older, more worn down. The anger she remembered from that night was replaced by something else, something that looked like regret, maybe even relief. "Alyssa, oh my God," her father said, his voice breaking. He stepped forward, his hands trembling. "I've been looking for you everywhere." Alyssa felt her chest tighten, tears welling up in her eyes. She didn't know what to say. The words she had practiced in her mind so many times seemed to vanish, leaving her standing there, silent. David cleared his throat gently, stepping forward. "Hi, I'm David. I've been with Alyssa the past couple of days. She wanted to come back, but she was scared." Alyssa's father looked at David, then back at Alyssa. His eyes filled with tears and he nodded, his face crumpling. "I'm so sorry, Alyssa. I'm so sorry for everything. I never should have let you feel like that. I was lost after your mom. I didn't know how to..." His voice broke and he covered his face with his hands, his shoulders shaking. Alyssa watched him, her heart aching. She could see the pain, the guilt, the sorrow in every movement he made. Slowly, she took a step forward, her voice barely a whisper. "Dad?" He looked up, his eyes red and filled with tears. "Alyssa, please come home. I need you. I love you. I'm so sorry." Alyssa's vision blurred with tears, her throat tight. She wanted to be angry, to yell, to blame him for everything. But seeing him there, broken and lost, made her realize that he had been hurting too, maybe as much as she had. She took another step forward, her hand reaching out to him. David stayed back, watching quietly, giving them space. Alyssa's father reached out, his hand grasping hers, and he pulled her into a hug, his arms wrapping around her tightly. Alyssa buried her face in his shoulder, her tears flowing freely now, the weight of everything finally releasing. "I'm so sorry, sweetheart," her father whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "I love you so much. I never meant for you to feel like you had to run." Alyssa clung to him, her body trembling. I thought you hated me," she whispered. He shook his head fiercely, holding her tighter. "Never. I could never hate you. I was just so broken, and I didn't know how to fix anything." David felt his own eyes sting, and he took a step back, giving them a moment. He watched as they held each other, the tension that had been wound so tightly between them finally starting to loosen. It wasn't going to be easy, and he knew there was still a long way to go, but this was a start, a step towards healing. Alyssa pulled back slightly, looking up at her father, her eyes still wet. I want to come home, but I need us to be better. I can't go back to how it was. Her father nodded, his expression earnest. I know. I promise, Alyssa. I'll do whatever it takes. We'll get help. We'll figure it out together. Alyssa nodded, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. She looked over at David, her eyes filled with gratitude. David smiled, giving her a small nod. You're going to be okay, he said softly. Both of you. Alyssa's father looked at David, his eyes filled with gratitude and emotion. Thank you. I don't even know how to thank you for bringing my daughter back to me. David shook his head. No thanks needed. Just take care of each other. That's all that matters. Alyssa took a deep breath, her hand still holding her father's. She felt scared, but she also felt something she hadn't in a long time. Hope. She turned to David, her voice soft. Will you stay for a while, just until we're settled? David smiled. Of course, Alyssa. As long as you need me. The three of them stood there for a moment, the morning sun warming their faces. Alyssa knew it wouldn't be easy, that there were still a lot of wounds to heal. But she also knew that she wasn't alone, and that, for now, was enough. David walked alongside Alyssa and her father as they moved inside the house. The air between them was filled with a mix of tension, exhaustion, and a hint of hope. Alyssa's father opened the door, the faint creak sounding much louder than usual in the silence that surrounded them. The house was dimly lit, the curtains still drawn, and a stale heaviness hung in the air. Alyssa stepped in, her eyes scanning the room. It was the same as when she left, the same couch, the same clutter on the kitchen counter. Everything seemed untouched, as if time had paused while she was gone. She took a deep breath, her gaze flicking to her father, who stood behind her, watching her carefully. Are you okay? He asked, his voice hesitant. Alyssa nodded, though she wasn't entirely sure if she believed it. Yeah, I think so, she said softly. David stepped in behind them, standing near the door, unsure if he should stay or give them space. Alyssa looked back at him, her eyes filled with uncertainty. David caught her gaze and gave her a reassuring nod. I'm just here if you need anything, he said gently. You two have a lot to talk about. Alyssa's father cleared his throat, stepping further into the living room. Why don't we sit down? He gestured towards the couch, his voice shaky. Alyssa hesitated for a moment, then nodded, moving slowly towards the couch and sitting down. She set her backpack at her feet, her fingers picking at the straps. Her father sat down beside her, leaving a small gap between them. He leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees, his hands rubbing together nervously. The silence between them stretched, heavy with everything they wanted to say but couldn't quite find the words for. David moved over to the armchair in the corner, sitting down and watching them quietly. He could see the struggle in both of their faces, the fear of saying the wrong thing and making everything worse. He decided to give them a little nudge. Maybe you could start by just telling each other how you feel right now, David said softly, his voice breaking the silence. Alyssa looked at her father, her eyes glistening. She swallowed hard, her fingers trembling slightly as she took a deep breath. I'm scared, she admitted, her voice almost a whisper. I'm scared that everything is just going to go back to how it was before. I can't handle that. Her father looked at her, his eyes filled with pain. I know, Alyssa. I know I failed you. I let my own pain get in the way of being there for you. I was angry, and I took it out on you, and that's not fair. I know I need to do better. I want to do better. I don't know how, but I'm willing to try. Alyssa looked down, her tears spilling over. I felt like you didn't want me. like you blamed me for what happened to Mom." Her voice broke, and she covered her face with her hands, her shoulders shaking. Her father's face crumpled, and he reached out, his hand hovering for a moment before gently resting on her shoulder. "Oh, Alyssa, I never blamed you. Not for a second. I just didn't know how to deal with losing her. I was so broken, and I didn't know how to help you when I couldn't even help myself. But I never stopped loving you. I could never stop." Alyssa looked up at him, her eyes red and puffy. "I miss her so much," she whispered, her voice trembling. Her father nodded, his own tears spilling down his cheeks. "I do too, sweetheart. Every single day. But we still have each other. And I don't want to lose you too." David watched, his heart aching at the raw emotion between them. He could see that they were both trying, both wanting to bridge the gap that had grown between them. He decided to step in, his voice gentle but steady. "You two are both hurting, and it's okay to admit that. It's okay to be scared, and it's okay to not know exactly how to fix everything. But what matters is that you're both here, willing to try. That's a big step." Alyssa looked over at David, her eyes filled with gratitude. She took a deep breath, nodding slowly. She turned back to her father, her voice soft but firm. "I want things to be different. I want us to be a family again. But I need you to promise me that you'll try to get help too. I can't do this alone." Her father nodded, his expression earnest. "I promise, Alyssa. I'll do whatever it takes. Counseling, support groups, whatever you think we need, I'll do it." Alyssa swallowed hard, a small flicker of hope sparking in her chest. It was still scary, still uncertain, but maybe, just maybe, there was a chance they could heal. She reached out, her hand resting on her father's. He looked down at her hand, his eyes filling with tears, and he squeezed it gently. David smiled, his eyes softening as he watched the connection between them grow. It wasn't perfect. It was messy and painful, but it was real. And that was what mattered. After a few moments, David cleared his throat, breaking the quiet. "I don't want to overstep, but maybe it would be a good idea for you two to spend some time together today. Just the two of you. I can stay nearby if you need me, but I think this time could be good for both of you." Alyssa's father nodded, his eyes meeting David's. "I think that's a good idea. Thank you for everything you've done, David. You've been a blessing to us." David smiled, shaking his head. "I'm just glad I could help. You both deserve a chance to heal." Alyssa looked over at David, her voice shaky but sincere. "Thank you for not giving up on me." David's smile grew and he nodded. "You're welcome, Alyssa. But remember, you're the one who made the choice to be here. You're stronger than you think." Alyssa's father stood up, gently helping Alyssa to her feet. "How about we go for a walk, just around the block, maybe grab some ice cream? I know it's not much, but it could be a start." Alyssa looked at him, her heart pounding with both fear and hope. She nodded slowly, a small smile tugging at her lips. "Yeah, I'd like that." David watched as they walked towards the door, Alyssa's father wrapping an arm around her shoulders. He could see the hesitation in Alyssa's movements, but he could also see the trust beginning to rebuild, piece by piece. He stayed behind, giving them the space they needed, but his heart swelled with hope. They stepped outside, the sunlight warming their faces. Alyssa looked around, taking in the familiar sights of her neighborhood. It felt different now, less overwhelming, less frightening. With her father beside her, she felt a little braver. And maybe, just maybe, that bravery would be enough. David stayed on the porch, watching them as they made their way down the street. He could hear their voices, quiet and uncertain, but filled with the beginnings of something new. He smiled, feeling a sense of peace settle over him. This was what he had wanted for Alyssa, a chance to heal, a chance to be with her family again. Alyssa's father glanced back, giving David a small nod of appreciation, and David returned the gesture. He knew there was still a long road ahead for them. Healing didn't happen overnight, and there would be more hard days. But for now, they had each other, and they were willing to try. David walked back inside, closing the door softly behind him. He sat down on the couch, letting out a deep breath. He felt tired, but it was a good kind of tired. The kind that came from knowing you had done something that mattered. He leaned back, closing his eyes for a moment, letting the quiet of the house wash over him. Outside, Alyssa and her father walked down the street, their steps slow but steady. They talked quietly, their words awkward at times, but filled with honesty. They passed the corner store, and Alyssa looked up at her father, her voice soft. "Can we get some ice cream?" she asked. Her father smiled, nodding. "Of course, whatever you want, sweetheart." Alyssa smiled back, and for the first time in what felt like forever, she felt a glimmer of happiness, a feeling that things could be okay. They weren't there yet, but they were taking steps, and as long as they kept moving forward, that was enough. The afternoon sun was starting to dip below the trees, casting long shadows across the neighborhood as Alyssa and her father slowly made their way back home. The walk had been quiet, but not uncomfortable. They had spoken in short, tentative sentences, finding their rhythm in the small, simple moments, talking about the weather, pointing out old neighbors' houses, and reminiscing about places they used to visit. They had even stopped for ice cream. Alyssa had chosen her favorite flavor, chocolate chip, and her father had gotten vanilla, just like he always did. It felt almost like old times, almost like when her mom was still there. But even in the familiar, there was the quiet acknowledgement that things had changed. Her mother wasn't with them anymore, and the weight of her absence hung between them. It was painful, but it wasn't impossible. As they approached the house, Alyssa glanced up at her father. He looked down at her, giving her a small smile. It wasn't perfect, but it was something. She felt her heart lift, if only a little. She knew there were still a lot of conversations to be had, a lot of pain to process. But maybe, just maybe, they could face it together. When they reached the front steps, David was still sitting on the couch in the living room, waiting for them. He looked up as they entered, his face lighting up with a smile. "How was the walk?" David asked, sitting up straighter. Alyssa's father nodded, his expression tired but hopeful. "It was good. We got ice cream." Alyssa smiled a little, holding up the last of her cone as proof. "Chocolate chip," she said quietly. David grinned. "Good choice. I'm glad you two had some time together." Alyssa's father sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Yeah, it was really good to just be together, even if it was hard." David nodded, his eyes flicking to Alyssa, who looked relieved but still a little uncertain. "It's a process," David said. "One step at a time." Alyssa's father gestured towards the kitchen. "Do you want something to drink, David? Water, coffee?" David smiled, shaking his head. "I'm good, thanks. I'm just here to help however I can." Alyssa set her backpack on the floor near the couch, her gaze moving towards David. She took a deep breath, her voice hesitant. Can you stay for dinner?" David's eyes widened a little in surprise, and then he smiled, nodding. "Of course, Alyssa. I'd be happy to." Alyssa's father looked at David, gratitude in his eyes. "Thank you. It would mean a lot. We could use the company." David stood up, brushing his hands on his jeans. "All right then. What's for dinner?" Alyssa's father chuckled, scratching his head. "I'm not much of a cook. Maybe we could order something in. Pizza, maybe?" Alyssa's eyes lit up at the mention of pizza. She glanced at David, her voice a little more confident now. "Pepperoni?" David grinned. "Pepperoni sounds perfect." Her father pulled out his phone, dialing the number of a local pizza place while David and Alyssa settled back down in the living room. The tension was still there, lingering in the air, but it was different now, less suffocating, more manageable. It felt like they were all on the same team, working towards something better. As her father placed the order, Alyssa looked at David, her voice quiet. "Thank you. For staying." David met her gaze, his eyes soft. "I wouldn't be anywhere else, Alyssa." She nodded, her eyes drifting down to her hands. "It's just, I don't think I could do this without you." David leaned forward, his voice gentle. "You're doing it, Alyssa. You're facing all of this, and that's brave. I'm just here to help where I can, but you're the one making it happen." Alyssa looked at him, her eyes wet with tears. She nodded, her chest tightening with emotion. I want things to be okay again." David nodded. "They will be. It's going to take time, and it's not always going to be easy. But I really believe you two can get there." Alyssa's father returned, putting his phone back in his pocket. "Pizza should be here in about 30 minutes, he said, his voice a little lighter. He walked over and sat down beside Alyssa, looking at her for a moment before speaking. "You know, I've been thinking about everything, and I want you to know that I'm committed to getting help, real help, for both of us." Alyssa looked at him, her eyes searching his face. "You mean it?" He nodded, his expression earnest. "I do. I want to do this right. I want us to be okay again. And I know that means I have to make changes. I've already started looking into counseling for both of us." Alyssa felt her heart tighten, hope slowly blossoming in her chest. "I think that could be good. I think I need that too." David smiled, watching them both, seeing the openness between them. It was still fragile, but it was there. Something to build on. The sound of the doorbell broke the moment, and Alyssa's father stood up. "That must be the pizza," he said, moving towards the door. He returned with 2 boxes, setting them on the coffee table. The smell of melted cheese and pepperoni filled the room, and Alyssa's stomach growled in response. They all sat on the floor around the coffee table, opening the boxes and grabbing slices. It was simple, unplanned, and yet it felt perfect. Alyssa watched as her father and David chatted about mundane things, the weather, a recent sports game, even the best toppings for pizza. She stayed mostly quiet, listening, but she felt herself starting to relax, the tightness in her chest easing. After they finished eating, David leaned back, resting against the couch. "You know, I've got to say, this has been one of the better dinners I've had in a while," he said, smiling. Alyssa's father laughed. "I think it's been the best one I've had in a long time." Alyssa looked at them, a small smile tugging at her lips. "Me too." There was a pause, and then David spoke, his voice soft. "You know, I think it's moments like these that really matter. Just being together. It doesn't have to be perfect." Alyssa's father nodded, his eyes meeting Alyssa's. "I agree. I just want us to keep having moments like this." Alyssa looked down at her hands, her heart pounding. I think we can," she said quietly. David smiled, his eyes filled with warmth. "I know you can." The night grew later, and eventually David stood up, stretching his arms. "I should probably get going," he said, though he looked reluctant to leave. "You two need some time together." Alyssa stood up too, her eyes meeting his. "Will you come back? Tomorrow?" David nodded. "Of course, I'll be here." Her father walked over, extending his hand to David. "Thank you, really. You've been a lifesaver." David shook his hand, smiling. "I'm just glad I could help. You two take care, and I'll see you tomorrow." Alyssa walked David to the door, her heart heavy but hopeful. She looked up at him, her voice soft. "Thank you. For everything." David gave her a gentle smile. "You're welcome, Alyssa. And remember, you're not alone in this. Not anymore." She nodded, her eyes wet with emotion. Good night, David. Good night, Alyssa, he said, stepping out onto the porch. He gave her one last smile before turning and walking towards his car. Alyssa watched until his car disappeared down the street, then closed the door, turning back towards her father. He was standing in the living room, his eyes filled with both fear and hope. Are you okay, sweetheart? He asked. Alyssa nodded, her voice steady. I think I'm getting there, Dad. He walked over, wrapping his arms around her in a gentle hug. Alyssa leaned into him, her eyes closing. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start. And for now, that was enough. They stayed like that for a while, just holding on to each other, the weight of the past beginning to feel a little lighter. They knew there were still challenges ahead, still days that would be hard, still moments of doubt, but they also knew that they had each other, and that made all the difference. Morning sunlight filtered through the curtains, casting a soft glow across Alyssa's room. She stirred beneath the thin blanket, her eyes slowly opening to the warm light. For a moment she blinked, disoriented until she recognized her surroundings. Her room. It was as if waking from a long dream, one that had stretched for days and nights at the gas station. She reached up, rubbing her eyes, and took a deep breath. Today was going to be different. It was a new day, another chance. She could hear her father moving around downstairs, the sound of plates clinking and the low murmur of a radio playing in the background. Alyssa swung her legs over the side of the bed, sitting up and taking a moment to steady herself. She could feel the knot of anxiety still tight in her chest, but it was a little less suffocating now. She stood, making her way to the window and peeking out at the quiet street below. Everything seemed so normal, like the world had just continued without her while she was away. And now she was back, trying to fit in again. She made her way downstairs, the scent of something cooking drawing her in. Her father was in the kitchen, standing over the stove, flipping something in a pan. He looked over his shoulder as she entered, his face lighting up. "Good morning, sweetheart," he said, his voice cheerful but still tentative, as if he wasn't sure if he was allowed to be happy. Alyssa gave him a small smile. "Morning, Dad." He gestured towards the pan with the spatula. I made pancakes. I thought maybe it could be like old times, you know? You always liked them." Alyssa's heart clenched, the familiarity of it bringing both comfort and pain. She nodded, stepping closer. "Yeah, I remember." He smiled, flipping the last pancake onto a plate and sliding it in front of her. He handed her the syrup, and Alyssa took it, pouring a generous amount over the stack. She could feel her father watching her, the weight of his gaze filled with hope. She took a bite, nodding at him. "They're good, Dad," she said, her voice sincere. Her father's face relaxed, and he let out a breath she hadn't realized he'd been holding. "I'm glad. I wasn't sure if I still had the touch." Alyssa took another bite, chewing slowly. The silence between them wasn't uncomfortable, but there was something hanging there, something they both knew needed to be said. She looked up at him, her eyes meeting his. "Dad," she began, her voice soft, "I think we need to talk, really talk, about everything." Her father paused, setting down his coffee mug. He nodded, his expression serious. "I think you're right, Alyssa. I've been wanting to, but I didn't want to push you." Alyssa took a deep breath, setting her fork down. She could feel her heart pounding, her chest tightening. I need to understand. I need to know why everything changed after Mom. Why you were so angry all the time. Why you made me feel like it was my fault." Her father's face crumpled and he looked away, his hands trembling slightly. "I was lost, Alyssa. When your mom died, I didn't know how to handle it. I felt like I failed her, and then I took all of that out on you. It wasn't fair and it wasn't right, but I was hurting, and I couldn't see anything else. I didn't know how to be there for you when I couldn't even face myself. Alyssa's eyes filled with tears, and she blinked them away. "But why me, Dad? Why did you blame me?" He looked at her, his eyes red-rimmed. "I never blamed you, not really. I think I blamed myself. But it was easier to lash out at you because you were there, because I was angry at the world, and I was so broken that I didn't realize what I was doing to you. I know that doesn't make it right, and I know I've hurt you more than I can ever say, but I need you to understand. It was never your fault." Alyssa's breath caught in her throat, her hands trembling. She could see the pain etched on his face, the regret in his eyes. It didn't take away all the hurt, but it helped. It made her feel a little less alone in her own pain. "I wish you would have told me," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "I wish you would have let me in." Her father reached across the table, his hand resting gently on hers. "I know, and I regret that every day. I was scared. Scared of what you might see if I opened up. Scared that I'd let you down even more than I already had." Alyssa looked at his hand, her eyes welling up. Slowly, she turned her hand over, gripping his. "You let me down by not trying, Dad. I needed you." Her father nodded, tears spilling down his cheeks. "I know, sweetheart, and I know that I can't go back and change any of it. But I promise you, from here on out, I'm going to do better. I'm going to be the father you deserve." Alyssa swallowed hard, her voice shaky. "I just want us to try. I want us to heal. Together." He squeezed her hand, his voice filled with emotion. "We will, Alyssa. I promise you, we will." They sat there for a moment, holding on to each other, letting the words they had both been too afraid to say finally settle between them. It wasn't a perfect solution, and it didn't erase all the hurt, but it was a start, and that was what they needed. A beginning. After a long moment, Alyssa pulled her hand away, wiping her eyes with her sleeve. I think we should go to counseling. Together, I think it could help." Her father nodded, his eyes sincere. "I agree. I already started looking into some places nearby. We could go together, or if you'd rather do it separately at first, that's okay too." Alyssa took a deep breath. "I want to do it together. I think we need to face this together." Her father smiled, and for the first time in a long time, it reached his eyes. "I'm proud of you, Alyssa. I know this isn't easy, but you're stronger than you know." Alyssa looked down, a small smile playing at her lips. I think I'm starting to feel that too." The rest of the morning passed quietly, a sense of calm settling over the house that hadn't been there for a long time. Alyssa helped her father wash up the dishes, and they moved through the small tasks of the day together, each moment a tiny step forward. It was fragile, this new beginning, but it felt real, and that was enough. Later, there was a knock at the door, and Alyssa looked up from where she was sitting on the couch, reading an old book she had found in her room. Her father went to answer it, and when he opened the door, a familiar face appeared. David, standing there with a gentle smile. "Hey there," David said, glancing between Alyssa and her father. "I just wanted to stop by, see how everything was going today." Alyssa's face lit up, and she put the book aside, standing up. "David!" David stepped in, his smile widening. "Hey, kiddo. How are you holding up?" Alyssa walked over to him, nodding. "We talked," she said, her voice steady. "Really talked." David looked over at her father, who nodded, his eyes filled with hope. "It was hard, but it was good. We're going to start counseling together." David's expression softened, and he nodded. "That's a big step. I'm really proud of both of you." Alyssa looked at David, her voice quiet but sure. "Thank you for being here. I don't think we would have gotten this far without you." David smiled, his eyes glistening. "I'm just glad I could help. But remember, this is all you. You're the one making the choices, Alyssa." Her father stepped forward, extending his hand to David again. "I owe you more than I can say. You've done so much for us, and I won't forget it." David shook his hand, his voice soft. "I'm just happy to see you both on the path to healing." Alyssa looked at the two of them, a warmth spreading through her chest. She felt stronger, braver than she had in a long time. There was still fear, still uncertainty, but now there was something more. Hope. And it made all the difference. David stayed for a while, the three of them sitting down together and talking. They discussed their plans for counseling, how they would take things one day at a time. They laughed a little, sharing small, light-hearted moments that reminded Alyssa of how things used to be, before everything fell apart. And as the afternoon sun filtered through the windows, Alyssa felt a sense of peace begin to settle in her heart. Eventually, David stood up, giving Alyssa a hug. "I'll check in again soon, okay? And remember, I'm always just a phone call away." Alyssa nodded, her arms wrapped around him. "Thank you, David, for everything." He smiled, stepping back. "You two take care, and keep moving forward." Alyssa watched as David left, his figure disappearing down the street. She turned back towards her father, who gave her a gentle smile. "You ready to keep trying, kiddo?" he asked, his voice filled with warmth. Alyssa took a deep breath, her heart steady. "Yeah, Dad, I'm ready." They walked back inside, the door closing behind them. It wasn't going to be easy. Alyssa knew that. There were still a lot of days that would be hard. Still a lot of moments where they would have to fight to keep moving forward. But they had each other, and they had a plan. The morning air was crisp as Alyssa and her father drove towards the counseling center. The car was quiet, the only sound coming from the low hum of the engine and the occasional rustle of leaves outside. Alyssa glanced out the window, her gaze taking in the familiar streets. She hadn't left her neighborhood much in the past few months, and now, here she was, venturing out for something entirely different. Her father's fingers tapped nervously on the steering wheel, and he glanced over at her. "You feeling okay?" he asked. Alyssa turned her head, meeting his gaze. She could see the concern in his eyes, the way his forehead creased just a little when he worried. She took a breath, nodding. "Yeah, I'm okay. Nervous, but okay." Her father smiled, though it was tinged with unease. "I know the feeling, but I think this is going to be good for us, Alyssa. A real chance to heal." Alyssa gave a small nod, her fingers fidgeting with the hem of her sweater. She wanted to believe it. Wanted to believe that this would be the start of something new, something better. But the fear still lingered, deep in her chest, a reminder of everything that had happened. She squeezed her eyes shut for a moment, then opened them again, looking at her father. He was trying, and that mattered. It was enough to give her a little hope. The car pulled into the parking lot of the counseling center, a modest building tucked between rows of trees. Alyssa took a deep breath as her father parked, his eyes meeting hers before they both got out. They walked towards the entrance together, her father holding the door open for her as they stepped inside. The waiting room was quiet, with soft music playing in the background. A receptionist behind the desk smiled at them as they approached, her voice warm and welcoming. "You must be Mr. and Miss Daniels. You're here for your first appointment, right?" Her father nodded, his smile nervous but sincere. "Yes, that's right." The receptionist nodded, handing them a couple of forms to fill out. "Great. You can just take a seat and your counselor will be with you shortly." Alyssa and her father found a seat in the corner of the room, the silence between them heavy but not uncomfortable. Her father began to fill out the form, his eyes scanning the questions as he wrote. Alyssa glanced around the room. There were a few other people waiting, some with worried expressions, some with a look of calm resignation. She wondered what stories they carried, what pain they were here to work through. After a few minutes, her father finished the form, handing it back to the receptionist. They sat together, waiting, the minutes stretching out. Alyssa could feel her heart pounding in her chest, her palms growing clammy. She clenched her hands together, trying to steady her breathing. Her father noticed, giving her a reassuring smile. "Hey, we're in this together, remember?" he said softly. Alyssa looked at him, nodding. "Yeah, together." It wasn't long before a door opened, and a woman with kind eyes and a gentle demeanor stepped into the waiting room. She looked at them, smiling. "Mr. and Miss Daniels? I'm Emily, your counselor. Come on back." Alyssa stood, her father right beside her, and they followed Emily down a short hallway into a cozy office. There was a couch, a couple of armchairs, and a large window that let in the morning sunlight. Alyssa sat down on the couch, her father sitting beside her, while Emily took the chair across from them. "First of all, I just want to say that I'm really glad you both decided to come in today," Emily began, her voice calm and genuine. "I know this can be a big step, and it takes a lot of courage. So thank you for being here." Alyssa looked down, her hands in her lap. She could feel the tension in her body, the way her shoulders were hunched forward, as if bracing herself for something. Emily seemed to notice, her eyes gentle as she spoke. "There's no rush here. This is your space, and we're going to move at your pace. Today we're just going to talk a little, get to know each other, and see where you're both at. Sound good?" Her father nodded, his eyes meeting Emily's. "That sounds good. We really want to work on things, to be better." Alyssa glanced at him, then at Emily. "I want that too," she said, her voice quiet but steady. Emily smiled. "That's a great place to start. Why don't you tell me a little about what brings you here today?" Alyssa took a deep breath, her father's hand resting on the couch beside hers, not quite touching but close enough that she could feel his support. She looked at Emily, her voice trembling slightly. "It's been a hard few months. After my mom passed away, everything just fell apart. My dad and I, we stopped talking, and it felt like we were both just lost." Her father nodded, his eyes glistening. "I didn't handle it well. I know that. I let my own grief consume me, and I pushed Alyssa away. I hurt her, and I regret that more than anything." Alyssa swallowed, her throat tight. "I ran away. I didn't know what else to do. I felt like he didn't want me around anymore, like everything was my fault." Emily listened, her eyes filled with empathy. "Thank you for sharing that, Alyssa. And thank you, Mr. Daniels, for being honest about your role in what's happened. It's clear that there's a lot of pain here, but I also see a lot of love." Her father looked at Alyssa, his voice breaking. "I love you so much, Alyssa. I know I failed you, but I'm here now. I want to do whatever it takes to make things right." Alyssa blinked back tears, her hand reaching out to rest on top of his. "I love you too, Dad. I just want us to be okay." Emily nodded, her voice soft. "It's okay to feel scared, and it's okay to not have all the answers right now. The important thing is that you're both here, willing to work on this. Healing takes time, but it's possible when we're honest and open with each other." They continued talking, the conversation flowing slowly but honestly. Alyssa found herself opening up more than she thought she could, talking about her fears, her pain, and the deep sadness that had taken hold of her since her mom's death. Her father listened, his eyes filled with both regret and determination to make things better. Emily guided them, helping them navigate the difficult emotions, and by the end of the session, Alyssa felt a weight beginning to lift. It wasn't gone, but it was a little lighter. She could see that her father was trying, that he truly wanted to change, and for the first time in a long time, she believed him. When the session ended, Emily walked them to the door, her smile warm. "I think you both did really well today. This is a big step, and I'm proud of you for taking it. We'll meet again next week, and we'll keep building on what we started today." Alyssa nodded, her heart feeling a mix of exhaustion and hope. "Thank you, Emily." Her father echoed her sentiment, and they walked out together, stepping back into the cool morning air. They walked to the car in silence, but it was a comfortable silence, one that spoke of understanding and a shared sense of purpose. As they drove home, Alyssa looked over at her father, her voice soft. "Do you think we'll be okay?" Her father glanced at her, his eyes filled with emotion. "I think we will, Alyssa. It's going to take time, and it's going to be hard, but I think we're on the right path." Alyssa nodded, looking out the window. She could see the familiar streets passing by, but they felt different now. Less intimidating, more like home. She took a deep breath, feeling the tightness in her chest beginning to loosen. When they arrived back at the house, her father turned off the engine, looking over at her. "How about we go do something together? Just the two of us. Maybe go to the park or take a drive somewhere. I want to spend time with you." Alyssa thought for a moment, then nodded. "Yeah, I think I'd like that." They got out of the car and her father smiled, a genuine smile that reached his eyes. "How about the park then? We can get some fresh air." Alyssa returned his smile, her heart feeling lighter. "Okay, the park sounds good." They walked down the street, heading towards the small park that Alyssa remembered from her childhood. It was where her parents used to take her on weekends, where they'd have picnics and laugh together. It was bittersweet, but as they approached, Alyssa felt a sense of peace. They sat down on a bench, watching the ducks in the pond. Her father looked over at her, his voice filled with emotion. "I know we have a long way to go, but I want you to know how proud I am of you. You're so strong, Alyssa, and I'm going to do everything I can to be the dad you deserve." Alyssa looked at him, her eyes wet with tears, and she nodded. I think we're going to be okay, Dad." He reached over, wrapping his arm around her shoulders, pulling her close. She rested her head on his shoulder, closing her eyes as the breeze brushed against her face. It wasn't perfect, but it was real, and it was theirs. And as they sat there, watching the world move around them, Alyssa felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. A new beginning. A chance to heal, one day at a time. And for now, that was enough.